Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Kristen Johnson, and I serve as the Director of Diversity and Equity for the college. I'm so elated to have Dr. Garza with us today. She is going to talk about the history of Mexican Americans in Second Ward. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Garza, and then I'm going to hand it over to her. Dr. Garza is Professor of History and Humanities at Houston Community College. She is also a public historian who worked on the installation to document the Mexican American history of Second Ward. This permanent installation became available for view this fall at Guadalupe Plaza Park on Runnell Street in Houston's Second Ward. Her research for the Guadalupe Plaza Park project has inspired her current study on the influence that Mexican American business leaders had in the development of media to serve their community. Dr. Garza's broader research interests include Chicano studies, gender relations, and popular culture. Please welcome Dr. Natalie Garza.
Thank you. So I want to thank Lone Star College for inviting me, and thank my friend and colleague Juan Galvan for contacting me and setting all of this up. I decided to base this presentation on the installation that I worked on for Guadalupe Plaza Park and the overall history of Segundo Barrio, or Second Ward. And I am not talking about everything that's discussed within that presentation, but I wanted to highlight some aspects of it. And, you know, I learned a lot from doing this topic and working on the installation, and you know, just really grew to love this history. And some of the things that I think are important in looking at it is just the sense of community that has existed in this neighborhood for, you know, a really long time, since the early 1900s. And the contribution that individuals make both within the smaller community of Second Ward and the impact that they have on Greater Houston as well. So I wanted to start out with the timeline, just to give kind of broader context of what's going on in the world and Second Ward's place in that. To begin with, just a broad timeline. Looking at the development of Houston, you know, many people are aware that in 1836, when Texas gains its independence, you have Mexican prisoners of war and Black slaves that are clearing the land along Buffalo Bayou for development. And the neighborhood that becomes Second Ward is actually considered the first like suburb of Houston, one of the earliest communities in Houston, and you know, later becomes Second Ward. In 1840, we get the creation of the ward system, which was a political system that no longer exists in Houston, but you know, it was a political system. The city was divided up initially only into 4 wards. They met at the corners of Congress and Main Street and then spanned out in 4 directions from there. And Second Ward officially was bordered on the north by Buffalo Bayou, on the south, a little bit south of what is today Harrisburg Boulevard, and then on the east by what is today Lockwood Avenue. And so that is officially what, you know, Second Ward was, and they had their own representative and everything within the city government. In 1860, we have the eve of the Civil War. And what's going on in Second Ward during this time, the population, you can see here a little over 4,000. Over 50% of that population were foreign-born, people from 18 different countries, but the majority of them were from Germany. And so looking at the history of Second Ward, the population has shifted over time from a largely German neighborhood to a largely Mexican-American Latino neighborhood. In the early 1900s, there's a growth of warehouses and increased industry and manufacturing. A lot of these places, particularly those related to the railroad industry, become employment, homes for Mexican American immigrants to Houston. And we begin to see that immigration population grow in the early 1900s, really around the time of the Mexican Revolution. From 1910 to 1921, Second Ward becomes the main Mexican American neighborhood in Houston. And that's when I said that you really begin to see that transition in population from predominantly German to Mexican. In 1915, the ward system is officially abolished by city ordinance, but that identification with the wards is still really heavy in Houston. There are people who to this day still identify with, I grew up in Second Ward, and they have a lot of pride in that, and they also don't confine it to the boundaries that the city had laid out, right? People who identify as being from Second Ward would, go out as far as Magnolia Park, the Greater East End. A lot of people in those, neighborhoods around the official Second Ward still identify as being from Second Ward. In the 1930s, we see the Great Depression and the impact this has on the Second Ward community that is, now Mexican American, that, subject to discrimination because of the repatriation of ethnic Mexicans that's happening at that time, and major Americanization efforts to make sure that people who are, ethnic Mexican are becoming part of American society and culture. And that is definitely a part of what's happening in this neighborhood. In 1935, there is a huge flood in Houston. It's called the Great Houston Flood at that time. Of course, we've experienced many of those floods since then. But the people in Second Ward ran from their neighborhood. There's actually a corrido that recounts the events of this flood, and it's called La Inundación de Houston en 1935. And it talks about what happens, and it describes people running from their homes. The impact of this event, this environmental event, is that it leads to the creation of the Harris County Flood Control District and construction of the Addicks and Barker reservoirs. World War II, of course, U.S. participation in that war from 1943 and 1945. Mexican Americans from throughout the country are, heavily serving during World War II, and we see that with residents from Second Ward as well. In 1958, the construction of Southwest Freeway began, and Barrio El Alacrán, which was kind of a smaller area within Second Ward that today straddles I-59, right? It straddles the Southwest Freeway. Part of it is Clayton Homes today, and then on the other side, it's just, they turned it into a park. But that neighborhood that was a very Mexican American neighborhood is, cut in half. I have here newspaper clipping that says Rusk School give way for a freeway. So there was this school that everybody in the neighborhood went to, Rusk School, that is demolished as a result of the building of the freeway. And kind of looking at contemporary issues and how they parallel with that, there's discussion of building this new I-45 freeway, again, through the same neighborhood, and that likely people living in Clayton Homes and that whole area are going to lose their homes. So it's going to be divided even more so. In the 1970s, we get the Huelga schools. These were schools established to protest HISD's integration plan that paired Mexican American and African American students together, claiming that Mexican American students were white, and therefore this was integration. The Huelga school movement was really important step in confronting the racism and disenfranchisement of Mexican Americans and Latinos more broadly, but also want to make note of it because it marks, you know, a step in the broader Chicano movement of that time period. And you can see that there's activism developing amongst the community within the Second Ward. That activism becomes evident in a tragic case in 1977, the Joe Campos Torres case. For those of you who do not know, he was a 23-year-old Mexican-American Vietnam veteran and Second Ward resident. He died after being brutally beaten by police officers while he was in police custody, and his body was discovered in Buffalo Bayou. There was a uproar within the community, a very, little, if any, punishment happened to the police officers. There were protests, kind of a unification of Black and Brown activists joining together because a Black resident of Houston had also been killed in police custody, very close to Joe Campos Torres. And so it has a big impact on the Mexican American community. You see a lot of activism developing around it. One of the consequences of it in terms of policing in Houston is that they start to develop and really target Mexican American recruitment in the police force. While that doesn't solve all of the issues, there is an acknowledgement that that there needs to be change, right, and reform within the police system. And then the last thing that I have on the timeline is the opening of El Mercado del Sol, which is short-lived. It opened in 1985. It was an effort to create like a Mexican-American business district in Second Ward and, give people, small business owners in the community a space to kind of consolidate their various businesses, whether it was food or kind of Mexican artisanry, those kinds of things. And like I said, it was short-lived, but one of the things that comes out of it is Guadalupe Plaza Park and this space for the community. Going into some details about some of the things that I've kind of highlighted. What I think is really, interesting and important is the individuals that make up this community. And so I tried to highlight some of their thoughts about living in Second Ward. This is a quote from Manuel Crespo. Manuel Crespo owned Crespo Funeral Home, and he was involved politically, helping to start the first LULAC chapter in Houston. He was a business owner, also had been involved with the police force as a Spanish-speaking investigator at one point in his career. And so this is what he says about the neighborhood. He said, and if people needed a doctor around the neighborhood, especially other businesses were closed at night, so they came to us, meaning people would go to the funeral home in the middle of the night. And they would tell him, please call Dr. Gonzalez, please call Dr. Leyva, please call Dr. Vensor. And those were the three Latin American doctors in the neighborhood in like the 1940s. And so he said, we'd call the doctor for them. At that time, the doctors charged $2 to make a call to their home at night. So it's an interesting, dynamic at this time in the neighborhood that not everybody had a phone. And the person that they go to is the funeral home director when they need access to a doctor. And in fact, the funeral homes provided ambulance service, so it made sense for them, right? They had that connection with the medical profession. And many of these doctors had offices along Canal Street. For I don't know the reasoning behind that, but Canal Street in the Second Ward was the street where you found doctors' offices, pharmacies, and things like that. Frosttown was this niche community within broader Second Ward. Again, kind of around what today is Clayton Homes, and then on the other side of 59. And it takes on different names. So Frosttown was the first suburban neighborhood in Houston, and it becomes known later as El Alacran, which when it becomes a majority Mexican-American neighborhood. There was a particular street in El Alacran that was known as Shrimp Alley, and this is an image of Shrimp Alley. It was not paved roads. The houses you can see are, kind of like row houses that we would call today. And you had a lot of people within the community that this was their center of the world, right? That this was where they lived. This is where they grew up. They had, shopping in the area. And it was in this consolidated neighborhood where you had Rusk School, for example. So, they were even going to school in this neighborhood and everything. Brady Place is another neighborhood that develops further to the east of El Alacran. And you have like historic homes that were part of Brady Place and maybe a little bit upper scale people in the community. And then people begin to call the neighborhood as a whole Segundo Barrio or Second Ward, right? Of course, after the fact that it had been divided into this political section of a Second Ward. But as I said earlier, even long after the wards are abolished, it still is referred to in that way. Religion has been really important to the community. And I think, it's interesting to look at the history of religion in Second Ward because there are a lot of firsts regarding religion there. I have here a quote from a longtime resident. She has since passed, Petra Guillen. She loved Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, which is like the main Catholic church in Second Ward. And she grew up around the church. She went to school there. She was involved as a young girl with catechism. And when she got married, she talked about how she felt about the church and what she told her husband. She said, first of all, I'm living here because I don't think I would have ever left Guadalupe. And before I got married, I made my husband promise that he would never take me out of Guadalupe. So she actually lived not even a block away. Her house was across the street from the church. So before talking about getting into Our Lady of Guadalupe and the meaning of the church there, like I said, Second Ward has some firsts in terms of religion within Houston. The first Catholic church in Houston was established in this neighborhood, St. Vincent's, in 1842. The cemetery was founded in 1852, and the cemetery is still there. If you ever visit Our Lady of Guadalupe Church, to the right of it is St. Vincent Cemetery. St. Vincent's has since moved into, the church itself has moved to downtown. But also the oldest Jewish congregation in Houston and in fact in Texas was first established in Second Ward as well. Congregation Beth Israel, its first synagogue was located on the corner of Franklin and Crawford Streets in 1874, and this was considered Second Ward. It's now, you can see the building as it exists now, the Congregation of Beth Israel, and no longer in the Second Ward, but it had its roots there. And there's also a lot of Protestant churches that started out in Second Ward as well. So like I said, Our Lady of Guadalupe is important, really important to the community. It's a Catholic church. It was the first Catholic church in Houston. that was dedicated to serve the Mexican American community. So many people may not know that, there was segregation in Houston, but many people might not know that the churches themselves were segregated. The Catholic churches, congregants would go to, mainstream white churches like St. Vincent's and either not be permitted in or be told that they had to sit in the back of the church. And so the Catholic Church decides, to, instead of integrating or saying this is a problem, they decide that they're going to establish a Mexican national church, is what they call it. And they establish Our Lady of Guadalupe. So it's important to the faith of the community, but it becomes a center also for education. They established a school there that many people in the community went to. If you didn't go to Rusk Elementary, you went to Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. So a lot of people went to school there. And young women like Petra Guillen, who I quoted, were involved as catequistas. They were giving ministry to Mexican American children throughout Houston, right? So they don't, just stay within Second Ward. They travel to the various neighborhoods in Houston to teach religion to young children. And they're just like setting up on somebody's porch or in their backyard, and collecting the children from the neighborhood and teaching them. They were young women of like middle school and high school age. They dressed in like religious clothing, right? So they dressed as if they were nuns, although they were not in any way officially, part of a religious order. It's interesting talking to some of these women or having interviewed some of these women because for them, it was a sense of purpose, but also a sense of freedom that they had, because here they are, these young women that are getting to travel on train cars throughout the city. That was not probably the kind of independence their parents would have given them had they not been doing something for the church, right? They probably would have been more supervised in their movement and things of that nature, had, a chaperone with them or something. And so their roles were important to them spiritually, but also gave them a sense of independence. Other things that I think are really interesting about the congregation at Our Lady of Guadalupe is that when you look at the communication that the church ministry has with, the diocese of Houston, Galveston. So the priests, when they write to the Houston, Galveston diocese and the archbishop, they sometimes complain about the way that Mexicans celebrate their Catholicism or practice their Catholicism, and critiquing things like the fact that they have altars in their homes, or that they have a shrine outside, in their yard, that they make such a big deal out of baptism, and saying that they feel like the Mexican Catholics don't take ownership of the church. And I find that very interesting, because if you talk to the people who were the Mexican American participants who are part of the church, they very much do take ownership. And even from Petra Guillen's quote, she says, "This is my Guadalupe." And many people felt that way. They just weren't doing it in the way that the priests wanted them to, right? And these people are, active within the community of the church, but also take their role as, as activists seriously in other arenas. For example, in the 1980s, there were several parishioners who were part of Our Lady of Guadalupe who got involved in immigration relief, refugees coming from places like Vietnam, Central America, and they, became active through a interdenominational organization to fight for the rights of those people. So again, they very much take ownership both in their own, church community and their role in the broader community in Houston. The sense of community in the second ward is, very deep. This is a quote from Yolanda Black Navarro. She, I'll talk about her again, but she was a restaurant owner. She ran for political office, involved in a number of other activities. She now has a school named after her. She passed away about, I want to say maybe 6 or 7 years ago. She now has a school named after her. Jackson Middle School was renamed Yolanda Black Navarro Middle School. So she talks about the second ward. She says, the beauty that makes the neighborhood special is we still have that unity of community because there's still people that we knew from 70 years ago. So that kind of consistency and love of the people that make up the neighborhood. From its foundation, the sense of community that exists in Second Ward has really been nurtured through both individual citizens and organizations. Beginning in the early 1900s, there were community social services that contributed a great deal to the well-being of the people of Second Ward. And there's schools, community centers, medical facilities, all of those things emerge as the story of a people who support their friends and their neighbors and whose legacy of social service continues to this day. And so some examples of that, Rusk Elementary, which I've mentioned a couple of times, that school was established in 1902. It later becomes known as the Mexican School. And, as I said in the beginning, it is demolished with the construction of the Southwest Freeway in the 1950s. There is still a Rusk Elementary in Second Ward, that just the location has moved. Very much affiliated with Rusk Elementary was Rusk Settlement. It was established as part of the broader settlement house movement in 1908. And it was kind of like, the original community center. It offered education, it offered training for, for job skills, it offered a health clinic, it, was a social outlet for people, legal, advice, all kinds of things like that. And it was originally established to serve the German immigrant community in that area. But like I said, by the 1920s, it is largely serving the Mexican American population. And you can see a picture that I have here of people in front of Rusk Settlement. Synonymous with Rusk Settlement is Felix Fraga. Felix Fraga was a child that grew up in around Barrio El Alacran. He attended Rusk Elementary. He, was involved in the activities that Rusk Settlement had, because they had a lot of activities with children. Talks about his experience there, when he's a teenager, like 15, 16 years old, and kind of thinking about what he's going to do with his life, and encouraged by the people at Rusk Settlement to continue his education and to, pursue that to kind of improve his life. In 1940, there was kind of a parallel to Rusk Settlement established further east called Ripley House. And that, of course, still stands today. It has since expanded. But in the 1940s and 50s, there was this kind of invisible line, I believe like at Nagel Street. This was this invisible line where the Mexican Americans didn't cross. To the east of that line, it was predominantly white neighborhood, and to the west of that line, it was predominantly Mexican American. And so Ripley House, when it's initially established, is east of that line. And so it really, when it first starts, is not serving the Mexican American community. After the building of the Southwest Freeway, Rusk Settlement also, gets demolished. And so you begin to see the Ripley House become open and welcoming to the Mexican American community who has, kind of lost their home with Rusk Settlement. Also part of the community are the medical professionals and medical clinics in the neighborhood. I had an earlier quote about the importance of doctors and, having access to Spanish-speaking doctors. So you had the Mexican clinic. It was not officially called that, right? That's the name that people gave it, was the Mexican clinic. It was founded in the aftermath of the 1919 influenza epidemic, and it was established by a group of women, this women's Catholic group. So it's consistently been affiliated with the Catholic Church. It's later named San Jose Clinic, and while it no longer exists in Second Ward, San Jose Clinic still does exist. It has since moved into downtown and continues to this day to serve kind of underrepresented population, right? People who don't have easy access to medical services. So again, the importance of Second Ward, that you're seeing that there are things that begin in this neighborhood and then end up, having this broader impact on the Houston community. The medical professionals of like the 60s and 70s, I have listed here. These are people that, if you talk to anybody who grew up in the neighborhood around that time, they know who these people were. And again, all of their offices are on Canal Street, were on Canal Street, I should say. Dr. Pedro Salmaron, Dr. Max Abolafia, and Adan Trevino was a pharmacist. Another thing that is interesting is not just the medical services that they provided, to the community, but at least for Dr. Abolafia and Trevino, they also got involved in broader community affairs. They joined up with another woman who I'll mention in a bit, who helped to start the first Spanish language television station in Houston. There were large businesses. I mentioned in the early 1900s, you begin to see influx of industry and railroads. Later on, you'll see, oil manufacturing in the east end of Houston become really important in terms of business community. But then also there are a lot of small business owners, and many of these are Mexican-American business owners. The quote that I have on here is from Felix Morales. Felix Morales, along with his wife Angela Morales, owned a funeral home, Morales Funeral Home. So this is actually Angela Morales talking about her husband. She says, Felix said, the Mexican people have no exposure. They have no voice. And we have to have a voice for the Mexican people and let it be known that there are Mexican people here that are worth looking up to, and the businesses here need exposure. So what she's referencing there, as I have written here, is her husband decided to start a radio station. So he was already a businessman and decided that they needed to start a radio station. And this was his reasoning behind that. So going back to some of the industry and manufacturing that existed very early on in the history of Second Ward, examples of railroads, industry with Maxwell House Coffee, and Ford Motor Company, right? You have manufacturing, so you had, really important industry develop in the neighborhood. which were, you know, places where people were in the area were able to work and make a living for themselves, but also the small businesses. So I want to kind of stop here and say that these people, you know, who I want to highlight in terms of business leaders, of course, they were business people, right? They were business minded, wanted to make money and everything like that. But they also took their role within the community as very seriously, right? That they had a broader obligation to not just their geographic community, but to the Mexican American community more broadly. And I think that was reflected very much so in Felix Morales's sentiment about starting the radio station. And so these business leaders, one of the things that they do is that, you know, with the people mentioned in this slide and in the next slide, we see that they start the first Spanish language media in newspaper, radio, and television. All of those things, all of those firsts emerge from Second Ward, right? From the leadership of Second Ward. So I'll, you know, explain further. The Sarabia family, for example, there were 3 brothers of the Sarabia family, and they had multiple businesses. The eldest brother moved to Houston on his own from Mexico, and he started getting involved in recruiting Mexicanos to come to Houston to work in primarily the railroad industry. So that's how he starts to make money. You know, he's getting paid by corporations to bring people to work in Houston. He has 2 brothers that follow him, and they start a number of businesses. So they had a bookstore, they had a grocery store, they had a Mexican curio shop that was actually part of the grocery store. So by Mexican curios, I mean, you know, artisanry, spices from Mexico, you know, pottery, that kind of thing. They started a theater, the Azteca Theater, and they also had the first Spanish language, or I should say one of the first Spanish language newspapers in Houston, called La Gaceta Mexicana. So this is what I'm saying is that, you know, these business owners decide that their contribution is beyond business. And of course, the Gaceta Mexicana in part was a business enterprise, but very much seen it as a way to highlight Mexican American owned businesses, right? And to get news to the community about what's going on, not just in Houston, but in the broader, you know, national and international news. You know, a lot of these Spanish language newspapers of the early 1900s included, you know, literature. It was one of the few places where people could publish, where Mexican Americans could publish literature, because it was very hard for them to do so in, you know, otherwise, but they could do so in these Spanish language newspapers. They also published cultural events, right, so that the community could be aware and come together, and political issues that were important to Mexican Americans. The Moraleses, who I, you know, started off this section with, Felix and Angela Morales started a funeral home, the first Mexican American owned funeral home in Houston. They came from San Antonio, and Angela Morales was one of the few women to gain her license to be able to do embalming. So she's kind of, you know, innovative, or not innovative, but groundbreaking in her own right. And she does it out of necessity. She gets her license during World War II because she's afraid that her husband might be drafted. And so she decides they decide together, if the business is going to keep running, then she needs to get her embalmer's license. So Morales Funeral Home still exists today. It's still part of the family. The children now run Morales Funeral Home. And as I said, Felix Morales then decides to establish the first Spanish language radio station in Houston. And it was called KLVL Pasadena. That was the call sign, and their logo or their motto was La Voz Latina. And, you know, again, he, as signified by his quote, he believed like it was important for the community to have an outlet. It was important for business owners, you know, to be able to market themselves. When you look at both Spanish language newspapers and Spanish language radio, the way that they make their money is through advertising, right? So they had to get people to purchase advertising slots. So it's mutually beneficial, right? It's beneficial for the Moraleses to make money from selling ads, but it's beneficial for the Mexican American business owners to be able to say, like, you know, come to my furniture store, these are the specials that I have. And then also, of course, they had music and entertainment. Angela Morales also had a show where she helped people out, and it was kind of a fluke, how she started this show. They had heard of somebody who had fallen on hard times in the community, so she gets on the radio, she tells them that, you know, everybody who's listening, the story of this family, and that's it, you know. And then people start showing up to the radio station and giving her stuff, money and food and things like that for this family. So she realizes that this could be a thing, right? This could be like a service to the community. So it becomes a regular part of their show. A regular part of their radio station, where, you know, she talks about people who are in need, and people would go to the radio station to contribute, right, to that person in need. So the tower for the radio station was in Pasadena, but they actually broadcast out of a station right next to the funeral home. And it was kind of just attached there on the side. So the last person that I want to mention in terms of the media and, you know, the impact of business leaders contributing to media production in Houston is Mary Medina. So Mary Medina was a businesswoman. She had Medina's Ellen K. Florist, but that's kind of understating what she did. She also had a lot of property in Second Ward that she would rent to, you know, to people. She had a notary. At one point, she had a grocery store. She rented out a portion of her grocery store to a recording, not company, but a recording producer, right? She rented out a portion of the grocery store to him. And so you had, you know, music being recorded out of one of her businesses. And one of the things that she does is she joins up with Dr. Max Abulafia and Adan Trevino, and she helps to start the first Spanish language TV station in Houston, KXLN, which later gets bought out by Univision. And again, kind of similar to what the Sarabias and the Moraleses felt, is that this was kind of the next step, is that this was something the community deserved, an outlet that was directed towards the Mexican American population and that also served them. Right? So this was the last kind of arm of media development coming out of Second Ward. The last small business I want to mention was owned by Joe Villarreal. He owned the Arial furniture store. And I want to mention him because he's an example of somebody who is a business owner, but believes that he has service to his community, that he owes a service to his community, or that's his role. He had 3 grocery stores at one point, and ends up going into the furniture business when big name stores start to move into Houston, particularly Weingarten's grocery store. And so he sees kind of the writing on the wall and that this is competition, and decides that he's going to do a furniture store. So what I mean by him feeling like he has service to the community or wants to provide a service is that it's not just that he's providing furniture, is that often he would take alternative payment for the furniture, or he would let people take furniture without paying and knowing like they'll pay him back later, or they'll come back with food or something, right, of the nature to kind of give as repayment. And he's not the only one that did this, but I wanted to use him as an example because a lot of people remember both his grocery store and his furniture store and the service that was provided there, and remember him very fondly because of that. And also, giving people in the community like their first jobs and those kinds of things as well.
Hey, Dr. Garza, we actually have 2 questions so far. So let me get to the first one. The first question, when you spoke of the 3 doctors and the San Jose clinic, the question is, were those doctors involved with the San Jose clinic, or did they help out at other clinics?
No, those doctors had their own offices. So they weren't involved with the San Jose clinic. The San Jose clinic was separate.
Thank you. And the second question we have, in the midst of the collective racial discrimination targeted towards Blacks and Mexicans, do you think it was hypocritical for Mexicans to try to separate themselves from the oppressed Blacks and instead ally with those that were oppressing them?
I don't know that always happened, right? I don't know exactly what this question is pertaining to. Maybe about the Huelga schools. But again, I do think that there is a little bit of hypocrisy there, or a little bit of not wanting to be paired with African Americans because there's an understanding that that African Americans are discriminated against. But what the Mexican Americans recognize is that both communities are being discriminated, and that HISD at that time, both communities were underserved. Both communities had schools that were, lacking in resources and things like that. And for HISD to pretend like they were integrating the school system by placing African Americans and Mexican Americans together, they could see through that, right? And so it wasn't so much about not wanting to ally with Black students and trying to ally themselves with white students. It was pointing out that what HISD was trying to do was a fallacy, that it wasn't true integration. It wasn't really serving either community any better, because they're putting 2 underserved communities together and pretending like it's progress. And they knew that nothing was going to change should that continue. And also, I mentioned in the timeline the Joe Campos Torres case, in which you do see Black and Brown unity and activism taking place to combat the racial violence being committed by the police force. And that was going on quite a bit in Houston around that time. There were coalitions of Black and Brown activists from various levels, right? From people who were, radical up to politicians, working together to improve conditions for both Mexican American and African American communities. So at the lower levels, they're protesting and things like that. But at the levels of like a political arena, Black and Brown activists are joining or unifying and supporting slates of candidates that were, some were Mexican, some were African American, and saying, this is who we're gonna support as slates of candidates, so that we can have Black and brown representation in Houston politics, right? And that's how you get some of the first citywide Mexican American and African American politicians elected, because they joined together. So I don't think it's quite accurate to say that, Mexican Americans allied themselves always with like the white community, because we see instances where that was not happening.
Thank you for providing some more context around that, Dr. Garza. We do have a few more questions coming in, so I want to try to get to as many as possible. One of the questions is, and I think this is a great question. I live in 3rd Ward, so I'm fairly close to 2nd Ward, and I see both neighborhoods changing daily. And so we have Dr. Garza who asks, what does the community look like now? Is it the same, or is it changing? And if it's changing, how so?
It is changing. I mean, you're seeing gentrification in both communities. You can drive around and there's new housing developments going up, and they're in a price range that, a lot of people in the community can't afford. So there is a lot of change happening. And at the same time, I think, I don't know as much about 3rd Ward, but I think that there are efforts in both communities for, a lot of the culture to remain, right? So when we think of like Project Row Houses in 3rd Ward, and efforts of, I think it's called the Navigation Business District, which is predominantly Mexican American owned businesses, the efforts of those populations are trying to kind of assert the importance of the culture and the community and the businesses, and communicating with new residents that this is part of what they like about the neighborhood, right? They like that it's close to the city, they like that it's affordable, but often people moving in also like that there's this culture surrounding them. And so I think there's kind of a constant effort to push that communication that, if that's part of what you like about it, then you need to fight to keep it. And so there are longtime residents of the community that are trying to do that. And in fact, this project that I worked on was pushed for by those residents. Yolanda Black Navarro spearheaded the history installation at Guadalupe Plaza Park, and she got other business leaders in the neighborhood to back it, and they put pressure on the Parks Department and on the City of Houston, the council members, to put money behind it so that they could preserve the history. Now, that doesn't solve everything, but it's an example of people trying to kind of, like I said, fight for the culture and the community to, it's not going to stay the same, right? Things change, but to continue to appreciate what exists and the history that's there.
Absolutely. These are some really great questions that are coming through. Someone asked, was there any strife between the Catholic community and Jewish community?
Not that I know of. And the Jewish community, the congregation Beth Israel was not in 2nd Ward for a very long time. Right? So, there's not a very big Jewish presence there now, and it was not there for a long time. But I think it's interesting that, that it got its start there, because this was, like I said, the first suburban neighborhood in Houston. And so you had some like high profile people that were living in this area of town at the end of the 1800s.
So we have, it's actually a comment as opposed to a question, but they said, as a member of the greater Houston area, they want to thank the panelists for having this meeting. This is history that they would have never known before, and it helps appreciate the history of Houston. So thank you for that comment that was made by that attendee. So, and I think it's so true. I mean, I tell students all the time, like, one of the greatest things about living in the Houston metro area is that there's so much history and culture. Like, you should take advantage. If you're a person who doesn't necessarily want to travel internationally or even domestically, being just in Houston can kind of give you a taste of different parts of the world. And it may take a 30 or 45-minute drive, but I assure you that is worth it. So thank you to that student. Another comment that someone said is that one of their students who lived in Second Ward really felt pressured to sell their property because they were worried about the property taxes going up.
Right. I mean, that's one of the processes of gentrification, is that you get these new developments, right? And the homes are, like I said, out of the price range, but and what happens is it raises the value of all of their surrounding houses, right? So the taxes go up on houses that already exist there, right? And I mean, historically, that's always been a way of pushing people off their land. That's happened to Mexican Americans, from the 1840s, 1850s, of introducing new taxes to get them to sell, right, to push them off their land. And yeah, that's happening today. I live in the East End as well, and I get calls all the time of people trying to buy my house or getting notes in the mail. My kids are like, somebody's trying to buy our house again. And so there is a lot of pressure, right? And sometimes, it's hard for people to turn down. I mean, and you can't fault people really, right? If the prices are beginning to be out of their range, it's hard to turn down when somebody is offering you cash for your house. And so I don't know. I mean, I think it's problematic. And I don't know how to stop that process, but it is happening, right? And I think people are correct to acknowledge that it's happening, and to decide how they can combat it if they think it's important enough to do so, important to preserve, aspects of the community. Then people should be questioning how can we stop that, or how can we prevent it?
Absolutely. And I think that, I mean, you hit the nail on the head when you talk about how does the community get involved. And it's, being involved, civically engaged in the people who represent your communities. And today is the first day of early voting. So if you haven't gone out to vote, go to vote. But this is how you have change happen in your community. So I'm sorry to make that plug, but that was important to mention, is to exercise our civic duty. I see a lot of people just saying that this has been great. They've really appreciated it. Let me make sure I haven't missed any other questions. Someone said, I think programs like this, preserving the culture, absolutely help. Someone else said it's a travesty. People should be grandfathered in on their tax rate if they are long-term residents. All great things. And so, Dr. Galvin, I want to give you a chance if you want to weigh in on what we've talked about, or if there's any, last questions that we have for Dr. Garza, we can go ahead and do that as well.
I'm really happy that Dr. Garza came today and spoke to our students and to ourselves. And I really want to thank Dr. Garza, and I want to thank you, Kristen, for putting this together, for making this a reality. We have been trying to get Dr. Garza here for for years that at some kind of event, and it became a reality. The presentation was really excellent. I mean, I learned a lot, and I, as a follow-up, I stopped by Ripley House this morning, 4401 navigation, because that's one of the sites for early voting, and it's really exciting to have this research presented here at Lone Star College-Kingwood, and to have this event for National Hispanic Heritage Month. So that's that's what I want to say. Thank you for making this a reality.
Thank you, Juan.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Dr. Garza.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Yes, yeah. It's Dr. Garza and I go back. We met in when we were new graduate students at the University of Houston back in a few decades ago, well over a decade ago. So thank you very much.
Sorry, I was just leaving a lasting message in the chat. But again, Dr. Garza, thank you so much. I think you have enlightened us so much. I know I've learned a lot. I thought I knew, but you have really deepened my understanding about Second Ward and rich history that it has in our city. And so thank you for the amazing work that you're doing. And I hope you'll agree to come back and when we're in person again, do another discussion for us. But thank you to everyone who attended today. These type of events are ones that we love. I mean, we really are here to educate and to provide opportunities to learn more about culture. And so I just encourage you all, share something that you learned today with a family member, a friend. Have these discussions. It's so, so important. But again, thank you, Dr. Garza. Thank you, Dr. Galvin. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.